Vanishing hitchhikers seem to exist all over the world, and Chicago has its share of them. The village of Forest Park is a home to an elusive flapper who is said to hitchhike from the Melody Mill ballroom to the Jewish Waldheim cemetery, where she disappeared. Some reports of encounters said that she informs helpful drivers that she lives at the caretaker's house before vanishing outside the gates. Melody Mill was now a defunct ballroom, which has been surrounded by the strange stories since at least 1934. In 1984, Dave Hoekstra of the Melody Mill recounted to the Sun-Times a story that had taken place in the ballroom 50 years earlier. In 1934, a young man called Wally met a blonde woman in a snow-white gown who asked him for a lift home. The two chatted and made a date for the following week. Then she requested to be dropped off at Woodlawn Cemetery. 1 week later, Wally went to her address to pick her up. However, the woman answering the door claimed that the woman Wally described sounded like her daughter, who had passed 3 years earlier. While their story is a familiar retelling of the vanishing hitchhiker urban legend, the Melody Mill sighting got big publicity coverage in 1938. Tiny Hill was the leader of a band performing there at the time, and he recounted the story of a vanishing hitchhiker live on a WGN radio show. According to his broadcast account, 3 young men met a woman dressed in white at the ballroom. She asked them to give her a ride home, then got out of the car at an unknown cemetery. She hurried inside, followed by 2 of the young men. The following day, the police discovered what they described as 2 raving maniacs wandering the cemetery, while the 3rd man was found lifeless at the wheel of his parked car. Investigators found a purse that was left in the car and went to the address inside it. The woman who answered the door identified the purse as her daughter's, but informed them that she had passed. The Daily Northwestern declared that the tale was a good publicity stunt, and it does raise questions, such as if Wally had really been to the young woman's home, they would know the ghost's name, which is not mentioned in the story. Several accounts of Chicago's vanishing flappers seem to have been conflated over the years. While the Melody Mill story concerns a blonde woman, sightings of a ghost at Waldheim Cemetery have described a young, dark-haired Jewish woman in a flapper outfit. There are records of several young women who passed around the 1920s at Waldheim, but none of the ghost hitchhikers have been identified. Another set of accounts involves sightings of a spirit who has been dubbed Resurrection Mary. Witnesses of this phenomenon have generally been credited by local historian Richard Crowe with being reliable, level-headed, and with no previous psychic beliefs. As the oral history recounts, the first person to ever meet Resurrection Mary was a man named Jerry Palis. In 1939, Palis was a regular at a Chicago dance hall, where one evening he was attracted by a young woman whom he quickly asked for a dance. He found out a few small details about her, just that her name was Mary and she lived on the south side of town. He danced with the young woman all evening, and when it was time to leave, offered Mary a lift home. Prior to his passing in 1992, Palis was interviewed about his contact with Resurrection Mary. Relating the events of that night, he recalled that as they walked to the car, she said that he might as well take her down to Archer Road. He asked why, as she had said she'd lived elsewhere. But Mary insisted that she wanted to go to Archer Road, where Resurrection Cemetery is located. Palis stopped his car in front of the cemetery and watched Mary step out. Instantaneously, she disappeared before his eyes. Palis admitted to being perplexed, but certainly not deterred by the strange occurrence. Still intrigued by the mysterious woman, on the very next day, Palis drove to the house where Mary had said she resided. He easily found the house, and the woman who answered the door said that she was Mary's mother. When Palis asked if he could see her daughter, the woman replied that Mary had been deceased for 5 years. According to Crowe, Palis had then thought back and realised that Mary was no ordinary woman. He said that he then understood why the woman he was dancing with the previous evening was ice cold to the touch. Palis had worked in a funeral home for a short time and knew the cold touch of the deceased. Crowe later learned the ghost was thought by locals to be the restless spirit of a young woman called Mary Bregovi. Mary had been slain in a traffic accident in 1934, 1 month before her 21st birthday. she'd been laid to rest in Resurrection Cemetery wearing her favourite white gown. Crowe has collected 36 credible reports of sightings of Mary since the 1930s. Throughout those years, Resurrection Mary has been spotted many times at dance clubs, in taxis, and wandering past the cemetery in search of someone to take her home. In January of 1979, a Chicago cab driver stopped to take on a female passenger at the front entrance of Resurrection Cemetery, but before she stepped into his vehicle, the mysterious woman disappeared. Another witness was Claire Rudnicki, who saw Mary in 1980 when driving past the Resurrection Cemetery. She glanced out of the car window to see a girl walking on the right-hand side of the road, describing her as very bright, as if illuminated, and walking very slowly. A whole family witnessed the frightening spectre. They did a U-turn. By the time they got back to where they'd seen the woman, she had vanished. In October of 1989, Janet Kalal and a friend went out for an evening drive and were passing Resurrection Cemetery when a pale young woman stepped out before them. Although she had run out in front of the car and Kalal had hit her, they heard no bump of impact. Kalal distinctly saw the profile of a young woman dressed in all white with her gown and hair flowing backwards like a stream. There are over 60 headstones of young women named Mary at Resurrection Cemetery from that time, but the identity and manner of passing of both the Melody Flapper and Resurrection Mary remain pure speculation. But there are many young women in the cemetery who succumbed to pneumonia, tuberculosis, and even car accidents during that era.